Chromanoids. 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 Chromanoids.
Hello, we have John Palmesino from Territorial Agency. Territorial Agency is an independent organization based in London that combines architecture, analysis, advocacy, and action for integrated spatial transformation of contemporary territories. The first question is, are you human?
No.
In your work, you are always dealing with, or in your work, there is always colliding politics, territories, economy, and even the construction of the subject. No, could you talk a little bit about this in the Museum of Oil, the work that you are presenting here in the Istanbul Design Biennial?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the very kind invitation. The usual argument is that the very complex event of knowledge of climate change would lead us to keep oil in the ground.
Yeah.
The counter-argument is that we can't, because our economy, our material structures depend on oil. So we ought to keep oil in the ground, and at the same time, we can't, otherwise what maintains our life will fall apart. And so the Museum of Oil is an attempt to shift that argument, which is usually the carbon argument. You have to keep oil in the ground because of the untenable processes of extracting carbon from the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. We are moving it to what we call a human argument, understanding that not keeping oil in the ground is more dangerous, in the sense that the way through which we've structured and designed our world is so dependent on oil, and oil, in order to maintain its energy flows, is making our world so fragile that we have to militarize the supply chain, that we have to organize the juridical systems of our democracy so to grant always access to the inner rooms of power to the people who own oil. That it's become highly dangerous. So the argument is really how then to disentangle ourselves from oil, because we want to stay alive, we want to have our economies, but we can't. So the question is how to then get out of it. And the Museum of Oil is, in that sense, a very strange collaboration of Territorial Agency with Greenpeace in order to somehow transform a notion of activism into a notion of diplomacy, because you no longer have a clearly identifiable enemy, because we are the ones consuming oil. We are the ones creating the economy that is so dangerous for us.
And why a museum? Because it's a very specific kind of architecture, but also a very specific kind of administrative regime, in a way.
And the idea is that we need to put oil in the museum, to make it a thing of the past, exactly like you will have at the archaeological museums here, the constant narrative of previous empires inscribed into the history of the Ottoman Empire and then into the history of Turkey. So the idea is that when you have a museum, more than, let's say, a building and administration, what you have is a major narrative of transfer of empires. And what we are dealing with at the time we are at is the fact that our narrative is still that of a modernist progression of time. That, in that sense, the idea of putting oil in the museum is an intimation to start a different narrative of this transfer of empires. We no longer can simply think that we can have 5 Earths. We only have one. We have to reorganize our political, juridical structures in that accordance. So in this sense, the museum is almost a prototypical territorial agency project. It requires you to reimagine territories. that means the conditions that keep you alive. And by reimagining territories, we always try to then put those reimagined conditions in a public sphere in order to somehow instigate a discussion.
In this process of making visible some invisible ideas, no, that you were saying, that how to keep in the ground, no, in a way the oil, but also how to make visible, no, this kind of invisible or invisibilized reality. You are using a very particular way of display, no? Could you describe and could you talk a little bit about this very particular display of the Museum of Oil that is extremely powerful, precisely in the archaeological museum, but also in the Greek school?
It's there's a slight tilt in these very large panels that we use to somehow depict the territories afflicted by oil. And we call them satellite paintings. They are extremely large. In the previous installment, they were 9 meters by 6. This time we have vertical slices or horizontal slices of those original panels. But what is important is that they are sort of looming onto you. They are dangerous. And it's not something that you would usually find. Usually in a museum, you know that the pedestal is not going to fall down. You know, that the statue is there very safe. So there's a slight tilt in order to somehow disconnect. And the major issue about that is to avoid a possibility of an overview. The possibility of you being ever outside oil. There's never a possibility of having, say, a gigantic image in front of you that you will command, but it is commanding you. And so there's no external condition. You are in oil. And that's how we hope it is perceived. It's a condition of imbalance.
In this exhibition, the curators are claiming that we are living in this kind of different temporalities from 2 seconds to 200,000 years. You are also talking in your project that conservation, it is not about the past, but it is about the future. No? Could you talk a little bit about these different temporalities that your project is embracing?
The project is about uncertainty. It's not clear if the Museum of Oil is looking at us from the future, deciding to keep oil in the ground, or whether the horrible things that are on these panels, the destruction of environments, of livelihood, is the contemporary situation, or whether it's the future. So if we are in a museum looking at the future. So this is the first set of uncertainty that we are dealing with. The other element about the fact that conservation is about the future, it goes more or less like this, that you have to safeguard what is dear to you in order for it not to crumble. So conservation is nothing else than a preventive action in order to maintain from decay, to protect from death or from crumbling and from stumbling apart. So we think that there's this first set of uncertainty. We don't know where the Museum of Oil is. Is it in the past, is it in the present, or is it in the future? Plus the fact that we have to safeguard. That means that we have to territorialize oil. That means that we have to make it very clear that we want to scare people away from our territories, is the second element of uncertainties. So the two set of uncertainties were initially thought out as a counterpoint to our dear friend Bruno Latour's exhibition Reset Modernity, which you participated in by opening it with the beautiful reenactment of your Powers of 10. The question is, if we are in the contemporary situation looking at the doomsday scenario of a future dominated by oil, we really need a reset. for according to the procedures that Bruno set out. But if we are already in the future, looking back, then the conditions of the reset, and that means possibilities of simply reassessing modern values in order to maintain them while not destroying the planet, would be impossible. So the interesting uncertainty that it created with Bruno's project, I think, was the tension that we wanted to put in place. The question is, you don't know in which age you are. And it's the most difficult part. And so when Mark and Beatrice asked us about the 2 seconds and 200,000 years, of course, it makes complete sense, because we don't know at what age we live. It's the most puzzling element of our life. We don't know if it's before, during, or after the end of the world. Most probably we live in an age that has already passed the end of the world, and so we all feel safe. And the calls to act because the house is burning, I look at that, but no, we will have some techniques that will solve it. No? That's because we are ready after, say, the end of the world. And so,
the end of the world, I think that it is a perfect way to end this conversation.
Thank you.
So many thanks.